Hello, everybody. Welcome to our second online history lesson. Um, let's just do a really quick review of the way this works. Hopefully you've already done both of your history and science lessons from week 24, so this is week 25. Remember that on your optional supplies, it'll have anything listed that you might want to have to do this activity this week. It really is just paper and pencil. And then I've listed at least one optional activity that you can do on your own. And then I have just a paper that lists some of the things that I'm going to tell you that are kind of some cool things that we'll talk about today. So you do need quite a few pieces of paper, 4 or 5 pieces of paper, and something to write with. If you want to use some markers later on, go ahead and have those close by. But this is going to be a really fun one, and I love because it's going to be something where you're going to be able to use your creativity, which I love. So last week we talked about the Reformation, and we talked about that word reform. What does that word mean? Think about it just for a second. We gave it an actual definition. So if you are sitting and watching with somebody, with a parent or sibling, will you just let them know what that word reform or reformation, what it meant? Maybe not what it was, but just that word reform. And it's making a change to something in trying to improve it. And we usually talk about this in the context of maybe something social or with government. And so when we talk about the Reformation, it was individuals that were trying to make a change that they felt like was an improvement over the current system. And the current system all through history thus far that we've talked about in Europe was the Catholic Church. So our two figures, Martin Luther, and he was a German monk, and then King Henry VIII, who was the King of England. And both of them had a major part in the Reformation and the breaking from the Catholic Church. We learned all about Martin Luther's 95 Theses, or not about them, but why he wrote them. And then we also learned many of the ways or the motivations of King Henry and why he wanted to break with the Catholic Church and have all the power and all the money and have the religion allow him to marry and divorce. It was a really good lesson, and it was some really good information. But today we're going to shift gears now, and we are actually going to talk about probably the most famous author, writer, playwright in the world, some would argue, and that is William Shakespeare. Did you guess? So a few weeks ago in history, we talked about some of the famous writers, and William Shakespeare was one of them. And one of the reasons we didn't spend a ton of time talking about him in more detail is because today we're going to devote a whole lesson to him and his life. There's a lot about William Shakespeare that we know through his plays and through his sonnets and his poems. Not a lot is known about his early life. Whoa, that was not an earthquake. This week I'll try not to knock my computer off the table. I'm back at school now, not in my house. Hopefully it will be much less dangerous. But the cord right here, I keep bumping. So William Shakespeare. I have no doubt that every single one of you have at least heard his name, even if you may not know a lot about him, but you've heard his name. And that just shows how famous he is and how well known he is now, hundreds and hundreds of years after he lived. We have the whole Shakespeare Festival in Southern Utah, where they put on plays and then Shakespearean plays and also other plays in the theater. It's a whole festival. That just shows you one little glimpse of his lasting fame and his influence on theater and writing. So what I want to do today, there's a couple of videos. Some of them are going to repeat a little bit of the information from one to the other, but I want you to get your piece of paper and your pencil out, and I want you to jot down a few notes as we're talking about Shakespeare, about his life, about maybe some of his works. And I want you to at least give me 4 or 5 interesting facts. I like to take notes anyway while I'm watching a video. It just helps that information sink into your mind. But I want you to especially be listening for things that describe maybe how he lived, where he lived, maybe the numbers of different types of plays, the types of plays that he wrote, what the style was. Were they funny? Were they sad? Think about what was happening in history at this time, as far as we're going to talk a little bit about disease. We're going to also talk about rights, different people's rights. So we're going to watch 2 videos. The first one is a little bit, it's got a lot of information. This is where I think you'll get a lot of the facts. The second one is just a little autobiography, because William Shakespeare is actually telling us a little about himself. And that one's a really good one too, as well. So we'll watch those together. So get your piece of paper and your pencil out, and we are going to learn a little bit about William Shakespeare. Now, this one starts out, there was some information, I guess it just looks like the way it was edited for us, it cuts just really quick, but this is William Shakespeare talking about how he wrote. And again, this is something that we know all about. One of our very first weeks in school this semester, we talked about scribes and parchment and a quill, and we tried our hand at writing with a quill and ink. So you've got to remember, somebody like William Shakespeare, who wrote hundreds of plays and poems and writings, he was doing that without a computer and a laptop, or even a pen and a piece of paper, some awesome paper. He was doing it with parchment and a quill. So you've got to think about the enormity of that, and what kind of skill that took to be able to write like that. So that's our jumping off point right here. See if I can back it up just a teensy bit. Nope, can't do it.
Was made from dried animal skin without the fur, and my quills were all goose feathers with a sharpened nib, which I dip into the ink. Lots of drips and blotches. Try and imagine writing all those plays without a biro or a laptop. Not surprisingly, my signature looks a bit wobbly. It was tough work, but if you practice, you get good at it. Here's a page of mine. You can see, I found my name on the bottom of the page. When I was 18, I got married to Anne Hathaway. She was a farmer's daughter, like my mother, and we had a daughter called Susanna, followed by twins called Judith and Hannah. It was a busy household, but you know, don't you, what I spent most of my time doing? Writing! I had so many ideas pouring out of my head that I just had to write them all down. I wrote long poems, short poems, called sonnets, 154 of them, and all kinds of plays. I was an actor as well as a playwright, and I had a pretty good idea of how to tell an exciting story on stage. Soon, I organized a bunch of actors to perform my plays. We got together, a group of us called the Chamberlain's Men, and the actors would learn the lines as fast as I could write them. And then we put the plays on the stage. Girls weren't allowed to be actors, so all the girl parts had to be played by boys. We performed most of our plays at a theatre we helped to build called the Globe in London. What was the Globe like? Well, for one thing, it was pretty big. Around 3,000 people could fit inside it, and it had an open roof, so when it rained, the standing people got wet. When a performance was on, there was a flag flying on the roof. A canopy hung over the stage to protect the actors from the rain, and the trapdoor in the floorboards was a brilliant way for actors to pop up unexpectedly and surprise the audience. Richer people could sit in comfy seats in the galleries and get a good view. The rest of the audience stood around the stage, pointing and shouting and laughing and chatting and eating and drinking. Hold on a minute! What's that bloke up to? He's a pickpocket and he's taking that man's money! A few years after we built the Globe, disaster struck when a plague, which we called the Black Death, broke out in London, and the theatre had to be closed. Check out the plague doctor with his beaky mask filled with sweet-smelling flowers as he goes about the town trying to save people. Nasty job, that one. Glad I'm a playwright. Animals are dropping dead, people are covered in horrible sores and boils, and everyone is trying to save themselves. The Black Death was a nasty, dangerous part of my life. But what else was going on when I was around? Red-headed Queen Elizabeth I was on the throne of England. When I was still a teenager, the dashing sailor, Francis Drake, had sailed all around the world and then fought off the enemy in the Spanish Armada. When I was about 40, Queen Elizabeth died. and James I became king. He was a thoughtful, educated man, and he loved the theatre and books and reading. He organized an easier translation of the Bible so that more people could read it. I was a busy guy, always scribbling away. In my lifetime, I wrote 10 plays about great kings, which are known as the history plays. I also wrote 10 plays with unhappy endings called tragedies. Ever heard of Romeo and Juliet? It doesn't get much sadder than that. But I'm not all gloom and doom. I also wrote 18 funny plays called comedies, full of silly characters and stupid jokes, which still make people laugh. And don't forget the 14-line poems known as sonnets. 154 of them in all. Phew! Shakespeare died on his 52nd birthday. Worst birthday ever! 7 years later, a couple of his actor friends collected together all his plays into a book, which we know as the First Folio.
All right, let's get back to you and me. So get your notes out. Hopefully you took some really good notes. I have a whole page here in front of me. So let's talk through just a little bit some of these interesting facts about Shakespeare's life and about his works. So as I pointed out in the very beginning, remember he was writing all of these with parchment and a quill. So that right there is quite a feat. I know that my hand can get tired just writing a couple pages of notes. So writing with quill and ink, that was a lot. So we're very lucky that we can just type things out on our computer or use a really smooth pen. He wrote all the time. In order to do the amount of works, to produce the amount of works that he did, he was writing and writing and writing. He started writing earlier in his life, but he died at 52. So that's not an incredibly long period of time for him to be alive to have written so much. It gave you some numbers of his works. He wrote 154 sonnets. Now remember sonnets, we talked about those a couple of weeks ago. I'm assuming most classes that was in the lesson, and we talked about in my class and in some of the classes here at Davis, I saw some of your silly sonnets that you wrote, and you guys are very creative. Remember the sonnets have a certain pattern that they follow, and so there's a lot of creativity and a lot of thinking that has to go into writing those sonnets to make sure you've got the rhythm and the rhyming. But remember, it was the A, B, A, B, C, D, C, D, I know my alphabet, E, F, E, F, and then G, G. So we had a really good time writing some silly sonnets in my classes, and his weren't all silly and funny, but 154 of those. Then he wrote other smaller poems. He wrote, it talked about in history how he wrote 10 of his plays. They call them the history plays, and they were about some of the more political things that were happening at the time, about kings and some of those situations. He wrote 10 plays that did not have happy endings. Can you remember what those are called? Those are tragedies. And those are the tragedies where there is no happy ending. One famous one that I believe that he mentioned, and you probably know because it's been retold and in different movies, are based on the story of Romeo and Juliet, where with the tragedy, she's not allowed to be with the one she wants, so she fakes her death. And when Romeo sees that she has died, he takes his life. There is no happy ending. And for a lot of us, that's not a play that, you know, that makes us feel good inside, but that's why they're called tragedies. And it reflected some of the different stories that he had learned as a boy when he was studying in school, some of the Greek and Roman stories that he learned that had a lot of tragedy and jealousy and war and those stories. Having a hard time remembering mythology. Sorry. Have a bit, my brain hasn't changed, everybody. I'm still crazy. So those tragedies were very famous and I'm assuming probably really fun to act out. Then he wrote his comedies, funny, the ones that were funny and had a lot of silliness, included characters that just made you laugh and did crazy things. So there were 10 of those. There were 10 tragedies, or 18 comedies. I mean, 18. So you can see that he was writing all the time. He worked with a group of other actors, and they called themselves the Chamberlain's Men. Now, at this time in history, did you catch this fact? Women were not allowed to be actors. So all of these plays had women parts. They had parts, characters that were women, mothers and queens, and but women weren't allowed to act. So men played out all the parts, and that is something that was, it's just kind of part of history at that time. But it's kind of interesting to think about some of these plays where men played all the parts. They decided to build themselves a huge theater, and it's called the Globe Theater. And in the next video I show you, it's gonna talk a little bit more about that as well. But the Globe Theater, I have crazy hair right there. The Globe Theater was amazing. The way it was set up is there were seats that could go all around the top. I'm gonna show you a picture of the Globe Theater. Well, that is not. Okay. Here are some cool pictures. Let's get myself out of the way of the Globe Theater. This one is awesome right here. If it'll let us go in. There we go, right there. So you can kind of see that these seats were people that had the money to pay for a seat. They would sit in the round like that, and they were actually covered. People down here on the ground, these were the less expensive seats. They weren't even seats, you would stand. And they called these people the groundlings because they were actually standing on the ground. Oh goodness, maybe my picture will come back. Maybe it won't. Well, darn it. Here we go. The way it was built, the stage here, this is a really good picture. The stage here was also covered. So how many of you guys can remember what the weather is like in London and in England? It's rainy and cold. So the fact that they built an open air theater is interesting because, you know, absolutely people are going to be in jeopardy of getting wet. So I think that's why there was a lot of silliness and mayhem that kind of happened down here. People would eat and drink while they watched the play. It wasn't like now when we would sit and be quiet and watch the play quietly and respectfully. Here's another couple of pictures of the Globe Theater. If you have, if it's okay, if you get permission and you can look through some pictures with your mom or dad or someone and look at the pictures, you can see these cutaways of what it might have been like to perform on stage at the Globe Theater, what that stage was like. So everything was going great. He was writing plays. They were performing them as fast as he could write them. And then the Black Plague hit. Now we know, because we spent a whole lesson talking about the Black Plague and how quickly it spread and how much death was associated with it. And so they had to close down, and, you know, really was sad. And it made it so that he couldn't, they weren't able to do those plays. Now, just a side note that made me think when we were going to talk about this lesson is we learned some really good lessons during our lesson on the Black Plague and about sanitation and about washing our hands and being clean and trying to avoid the spread of disease. And I know that right now, where there is a virus that is very contagious to people, aren't we grateful that we very quickly know how to do things and quarantine groups of people and take those certain precautions that will help us from spreading diseases. So you can see, even just in our community right now in 2020, how, you know, it's super important to be clean and sanitary and wash your hands, to make sure you're not sharing your germs, you know, covering your mouth when you sneeze, or using a tissue and throwing it away. And we know all of those things, and we've learned those things because of diseases in the past, like the plague, and how their standards of sanitation. We talked about how they didn't wash their clothes and they didn't wash their hands, and their animals lived inside with their houses, and there was all different kinds of germs and bacterias and things that could make people sick, and that's why it spread so quickly there. So it's amazing the lessons that we learn in history, that we're actually getting a super practical 2020 lesson in what happens with that. So nothing to be scared about. Obviously the Black Plague was a really scary time, but we're so lucky that we know so much more now, and that we're able to have good medical care, and we know so much about being clean and sanitary, and taking care of our homes and ourselves. Kind of an interesting practical lesson that we're having. I'm very grateful that there are no Black Plague masks. Just those regular masks are fine. So I thought that was kind of a fun thing to think about. Let's see. I'm going to play you the next video. Now, he's going to tell you, this is William Shakespeare himself. Oh, he's so cute, so fun. But he's going to show you a little bit about what Stratford-upon-Avon looked like and what it looks like now, what the Globe Theatre looks like, the Royal Shakespeare Theatre, and then he'll tell you just a little bit about some other facts that are kind of fun to learn about Shakespeare. I want you to keep taking notes. Let's get back to our next video. I think this one makes me giggle a little bit. I love to giggle.
Hail, good morrow. Hello, I'm William Shakespeare. Have you heard of me? I'm a playwright, a person who writes plays, stories told by actors on a stage. Now, as luck would have it, this theatre's been named after me, the Royal Shakespeare Theatre. Imagine if I'd been called Nick Bottom, like one of the characters in my play, A Midsummer Night's Dream. It'd be called the Royal Bottom Theatre. It's not funny. Now, it's high time I told you something about myself. This is Stratford-upon-Avon. That's the River Avon just behind me. It's where I was born and where I grew up. Now, this is the house where I used to live with my 3 brothers and 4 sisters. It was really noisy with 10 of us in the house. Come on, let's have a look around. Knock, knock. Who's there? Me again, Will Shakespeare. Knock, knock, and lots of other phrases that you say today. Well, I made them up.
We're going to talk about that in a minute. This one too.
This is the room in which I was born. When I was a baby, I used to sleep in that cot. And when I was a little boy, I would sleep in this truckle bed next to Mum and Dad. But sometimes the mattress would dip. So to make it comfortable again, we used to tighten up the ropes underneath. And that is where the phrase sleep tight comes from. My dad not only lived at home, but worked here too. And this is his workshop. He was a glover, which means he made these gloves. And he sold them from this very window. Gloves? My dad would have made all sorts of gloves. Look at this one. It protects my hand while looking after this beautiful falcon. Now this is where my gran lived and where my mum grew up. I used to love coming here as a boy. But this isn't just a house. This is a farm. Let me show you. Isn't it wondrous? We have pigs and turkeys and horses, and we even have cows. Follow me. Aren't they lovely? Now, you may not know this, but when I was a boy, we didn't often drink cow's milk. We used to drink sheep's milk. There are all sorts of animals here. Look, here's a donkey, just like Nick Bottom. King's New School. This is where I went to school. Let's take a look inside. The schoolmaster, the teacher, would sit in this chair that I'm sitting in now, and we would all sit in front of him on benches. The long and the short of it is, writing was my favourite lesson. When I was a boy, travelling groups of actors toured the country. I loved seeing them perform. Their stories would make you knit your brows and laugh yourself into stitches. They were so good. And if truth were known, That's why I became an actor and a playwright, writing stories for everyone to enjoy. Just like A Midsummer Night's Dream.
All right, so I really liked that one. One thing that it brought out was that we owe William Shakespeare. He invented, they say, up to 1,000 new words and phrases, words that hadn't been used together before to describe certain things. This was a little part of our lesson a couple of weeks ago about famous writers, but you've got to think about this time in history where people were starting to travel and explore, and they were learning words in other languages and how it translated into the language that they spoke, and the way, like, some of the creativity of being able to describe something that just maybe one word wasn't enough for it. And Shakespeare was amazing in his plays at coming up with a metaphor or a simile. So a simile would be taking two things and making them using another word for something else. So you might say the sun was as yellow as pirate's gold. Yeah, that's a simile. And in something using like that, or using words and phrases like that in writing, in the play or in a poem, just makes it more beautiful and flow better. And then a metaphor would be saying that something is something else. You know, my love for you is whatever, so strong. But you'll hear a lot of those. But one of the really cool things that we can attribute to Shakespeare is all of the different phrases that he coined, and that became things that are in that we say right now. So let's talk about a couple. So one of the first ones that he mentioned was knock knock, who's there? So think of all of the billions of knock knock jokes that now exist because of William Shakespeare. So there's the best fact of the day. Knock knock, who's there? Came from William Shakespeare. So I've got a list here that I'm going to read to you, and I'm going to see if I can figure out a way to make you a list, or maybe this is something that you could do. You could do a little investigating, and I want you to email them to me. If you find that it was a phrase or a word that was attributed to William Shakespeare, I want you to email me and tell me so we can share them. But these were a couple of my favorites. What about a heart of gold? Now, my heart isn't gold. Is your heart gold? And at this time you would probably think, oh, gold is the highest, that's the most money, and it's the most valuable. And so if you were to say somebody, oh, they're so kind and so nice, oh, I just really need a way to say that just really conveys how great this person is, or, you know, how kind or charitable. Oh, it's like their heart is made of gold, a heart of gold. And that's where we end up with phrases like that didn't exist before. This one is funny. You're eating me out of house and home. Now, guys, have your parents ever said that phrase to you? They probably said something like it. I have a lot of teenagers at my house, and sometimes I feel like all they do is eat. They eat and eat all day long. They eat all my food until I feel like there's nothing left. And so the phrase came up from eating me. Oh, I can't see the play right off which one it was, but it says you're eating me out, or eaten out of house and home. And it's like, oh, we're so poor that they've eaten everything. They've eaten all that there is to do. For all I know, they ate, the blankets. That's a funny phrase, and the one that parents use all the time. Eating all the time, which is good. You should eat. You got to be strong. What about break the ice? Now, people at that time would have probably physically or literally broken the ice. Go to a pond, break the ice, try to get down inside, or break the ice off of maybe where they were going to walk. But it's using it now in a way of saying when you meet someone new, or there's a situation where maybe you feel there's some tension, you need to do something as if you were going to break ice. Kind of chop that ice up and make it smoother or easier to communicate. Maybe take the nerves out of it. So breaking the ice. So you can see where a lot of it. Let's do two more real quick. Another one is I'm wearing my heart on my sleeve. Unless you had a patch of a heart and you wore it right on your sleeve, that would be the literal word. But if you have somebody that acts in a certain way and they're just, they show all their emotions, or they show their feelings, and it's like they were wearing their own heart out here on their sleeve for you to see, what's in their heart or how they're acting. That's another common phrase that we use that came from a Shakespeare play. That one was from Othello. Let's see, let's find just one more really fast one. Knock, knock, who's there is still my favorite. And that one came from Macbeth. How about this one? This is from Romeo and Juliet. So how many of you have ever done something or heard the phrase a wild goose chase? So again, literally, if you were going to chase some wild geese, wherever they might lead you, then you were maybe chasing wild geese. But the phrase turned into being a way of saying, oh, you sent me on this ridiculous errand, or you sent me to do something that ended up not being what needed to be done, and you wasted my time. So it was a wild goose chase. So these are just some of the many, many phrases. And then there's words, so many words. I don't know if you remember those lists from before, but saying someone is green-eyed means, you know, that they're jealous, or that they have, you know, there were so many on that list. I'll see if I can relink that list from an earlier lesson and then maybe some of these phrases. But I do want you, this is an assignment, I'm going to give you an actual assignment. I want you to find one or two and see if you can attribute those to back to Shakespeare. Maybe something that you wonder, could it be something that was attributed to Shakespeare, like knock, knock? You know, would you ever guess that? So that's your assignment for this week, is to find maybe a word that's been attributed to Shakespeare. So I think it's really fun to think about how his influence, it continues well beyond the time that he was actually playwriting. So what we're going to do now is you are going to get your paper out, a couple of pieces of paper, and I want you to do a little activity. And this is an activity you can do with someone that you're watching with. Maybe you could make a couple, but you guys are going to do something called a concrete poem. Let me show you what a concrete poem is. Now, this doesn't have to be something based off Shakespeare, but this is just a way for you to get your creativity going. We've talked about Shakespeare and the importance of writing rhymes, tragedies, comedies. So this is just a kind of a fun little activity for you to do that has to do with words and poetry. So read this along with me. Concrete poetry, or sometimes you'll have heard it referred to as a concrete poem. And this is poetry in which the meaning or the effect is conveyed by visual means. Okay, that's a lot of words. It's really big words. So what it's saying is that this is a poem that you write, and the meaning of it, you actually have, you use patterns or words or letters, and you create a shape, like something visual to see that goes along with your poem. So it's a very big definition. I learn better by seeing. So let's show you one. So this would be a concrete poem. Let's move my face again. Now, this would be a poem or some words. And what do those look like? This right here is telling you exactly. They look like little airplanes. So if you were to read this poem, a click, a sputter, a whoosh to roar, a flick, a shudder, a push to soar, the wings, the nose held high, steady, to touch the plain, the sky is ready. Just a really quick poem, but then you can see how they've used a visual device, okay, patterns or words or letters and other typographical devices to convey the poem in something cool to look at. So this is a poem about airplanes, and then you use the shapes of airplanes to make this more visually interesting. So this is called a concrete poem. This is concrete poetry style. Here's another one. Now you could use animals, you could use sports, you could use, oh my gosh, you could use anything. So this is what I want you to do. I want you to, this will be the end of the video when I'm done. So this is just an activity that you can do on your own, but this is another one that I want to see. So after you've done it, and I know how creative you guys are, I am really excited to see some of these. So on this page, you can see that fox or the cat. You can do it one of two ways. For me, so I did it while I was sitting here for a second. I was going to try to make a soccer ball. So I started writing my poem about soccer, kind of wrote it around and made the circle. And then I thought I would use phrases to start to make the little squares on the soccer ball. That's how I started. You may want to write the poem first. You may want to think about something that you want to write a poem about, a fish, your house, a flower, chocolate, whatever. I'm laughing because I'm thinking of all the things I love. Whatever it is that you want to write your poem about, remember, you can keep it really simple. It can be very long. It can be sentences. It doesn't have to be the little short, like a short poem like this. And it definitely does not have to follow the sonnet. A, B, A, B. Doesn't have to do that either. This could just be, maybe it's going to be really freestyle. Something Dr. Seuss-ish. Seuss-ish. That's kind of fun to say. Say it. Say Dr. Seuss-ish. Blah, blah, blah. Whatever it is that you decide that you want to write your poem about, maybe you can either start with a shape first, a ball, like I did with my ball. You could sketch out a shape of a fish. You could sketch out a shape of a heart. You could sketch out a shape of, this one is Macbeth. One of Shakespeare's plays, Macbeth has, there's a knife involved or a dagger. And so I drew a dagger. Looks like we're missing a visual right there. Whatever it is that you think you might want to write your poem about, then work it into a shape, kind of sketch that out. Or you can obviously do the reverse, sketch out your shape first. I love the outline of that fox. I mean, it's very simple. It doesn't look like a full-blown fox, but you definitely know immediately that's exactly what it is. A unicorn, a frog. I'm going to a lot of animals. Maybe you want to do something a little more simple, something that you see in your house. But whatever it is, either start with the shape and then write the poem, or write the poem and then sketch in the shape and see how it looks. You guys, I'm actually super excited to see how these look. Now, again, it doesn't have to be Shakespeare-esque. You don't have to be using big fancy words. You don't have to be thinking of the format of a sonnet. It can just be freeform. This is totally creative on your part. So with your paper and your pencil, I want you, once we're done here, that's what I want you to work on. I want you to create your concrete poem, and definitely take a picture of it. I'm really excited to see what these look like. And then in the optional activities, I'll put a link where you can do a Shakespeare Mad Lib, where you can fill in the nouns and verbs, and then when you read it, and it will have the flowery writing or the flowery sounds of a work of Shakespeare. And then I am going to see if I can link those words and phrases that we can attribute to Shakespeare so that you can look at that. But I also want you to do that as an assignment. Write your poem, take a picture of it, and then also send with that email if there is a word or phrase that you found that's interesting to you that can be attributed back to Shakespeare. That would be awesome. So, this is a really fun time in history. There's a lot of creativity. When we talked about Michelangelo, and we talked about some of the creators and the thinkers and the doers, the engineers. This is a really interesting time in history, and this is someone who brought a lot of humor, tragedy, passion through his writings, and somebody that we are remembering. He wasn't really especially well known while he was alive. I mean, people knew who he was, but he's definitely famous after his death. So don't forget to do your concrete poem. Don't forget to send me a couple of Shakespeare phrases. And I hope that you're enjoying your time with your family, and that you guys are safe and happy. Hopefully we will all be able to be together soon. So have a really good week.